Hello, welcome to the Guest Writers Series. My name is Alan Borst, and I'm the administrator of the Creative Writing Program here at the University of Utah. This morning, we're thrilled to be joined by A.E. Stallings, all the way from Athens, Greece. For today's program, we'll begin with an introduction by Tyler Goldman, after which Alicia will read for us. Then Tyler will moderate our Q&A with some graduate students in our Creative Writing PhD program, and then we'll open up Q&A to everyone else. Please note that the Q&A button, not to be confused with the chat button, has been enabled at the bottom of your screen. So feel free to share any questions for Alicia there over the course of the event. Also, please know that this event is being recorded and we'll make it available on the U of U English YouTube channel in the coming days. We encourage you to purchase books by Alicia at your local bookstore. A link to one of our local bookstores, the King's English bookstore here in Salt Lake City, will be posted in the chat momentarily. The Guest Writers Series was made possible through the University of Utah's English Department and received funding from Salt Lake County Zoo Arts and Parks Program and Utah Humanities. Utah Humanities empowers groups and individuals to improve their communities through active engagement in the humanities. The series is also supported in part by Utah Arts and Museums with funding from the state of Utah and the National Endowment for the Arts. Now let me introduce our Vice Presidential Administrative Fellow, Amy Seiler.
We acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many Indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. And now I'd like to invite Tyler Goldman to turn on his camera and mic to introduce Alicia Stallings.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here today. Did you know that first and second century BC Roman bronzes of pigs are extremely cute? Did you know that the word squirrel derives from a Greek root, literally meaning shadow tail? Did you know that 1,500 dolphins were just hunted and killed in the Faroes? Did you know that Agatha Christie posed for a photograph at the Acropolis in 1958, wearing not one, but 3 strands of pearls, and one of the flyest floral print dresses you'll ever see? I didn't, but then I did. Because though I don't actually have a Twitter account, I do somewhat regularly and shamelessly stroll or scroll its public walkways, like a sort of digital flaneur. And the Rue des Stallings, I'm pleased to report, is where a lot of the action is. On any given week, on any given day, you might see Greek politics, global environmentalism, the agonies and the ecstasies of tween-age fart slime, underwater archaeology, and of course, a lot of poetry. I know it's not my job to introduce Alicia Stallings as a tweeter. I'm bringing all this up because I actually do see something of our guest's Twitter feed reflected in her poetics, especially when it comes to the way her books are made. Books that are unusually responsive and sensitively attuned to the world of which they are a part. What do I mean? On the face of it, the poems about broken washing machine doors and head lice and glitter are not the most obvious bosom friends of translations from Herodotus and Homer and Horace. And poems about a child's pull toy and a blacksmithing demonstration in Tennessee don't immediately present themselves as the most obvious bookends to a long poem about the Syrian refugee crisis. Now, there are some strange and beautiful connections to draw between these things in our guest's latest book, but this collection also seems to insist that there's something very much worth considering about recognizing and accepting certain types of differences, about recognizing and accepting that things happen, life happens all at the same time and on top of itself. Public, private, tragic, comic. That's what the world is like. It's what it's always been like. Air raid siren and oxidized cast iron, Twitter and glitter. We are unusually lucky to have poems in collections like these to remind us of this, and that do so with such clarity and evocativeness and excitement. One last thing, I didn't pull this one from Alicia's Twitter, but did you know that there are 17 exclamation points in like? I took a random sample of 10 poetry collections from the last 10 years or so off my shelf last night. And you know how many exclamation points I found? Exactly none. Is this a large enough sample? No. Is there anything profound to glean from this? I'm not really sure, but I'm excited about it all the same, and excited to introduce our guest tonight, Alicia Stallings, the author of 4 collections of poetry, including most recently Like, which, as Alan mentioned, is available at all of your local bookstores and online, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. She has also published translations of Lucretius's The Nature of Things, Hesiod's Works and Days, and the extraordinary Batrachomo Mejia, The Battle Between the Frogs and the Mice, with the illustrator Grant Silverstein. She has won far too many things to enumerate. I'll just refer you to the Guggenheim and the MacArthur grant. Please join me in warmly welcoming our guest today, Alicia Stallings.
Confused. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Thank you to Alan and to Amy and to Tyler for that lovely introduction. It always strikes me as sort of strange when people mention anything that I posted on a tweet. It's if I think it's like my secret diary, and then I'm suddenly sort of surprised that anyone can read it. I don't know why. I know it's public, but and I love the Twitter and glitter rhyme. I thought I might read some newish poems and then some older poems, because I have been getting ready for a selected poems. And the thing about selected poems is that it makes you have to look at your old poems and your new poems, and to see maybe some new connections, or realize what your obsessions are, and all of that. So I will start with some older poems, and I guess you might call these lockdown poems. They have been written during those lockdown months. I know everyone's lockdown was different. Mine included being locked down with 2 children and my husband, and various animals. So it wasn't really about solitude, but it was about maybe repetitive tasks and various other things. This first poem is a ghazal, which is a Persian and Arabic form that involves a lot of repetition and some rhyme. And those of you who have read my work know that I do like received forms, and I'm very interested in all kinds of received forms, and I'm very interested in repetition. I think, as Brian Eno says, repetition is a form of change. So I like how even when you repeat something exactly, it's never going to mean exactly the same thing. So this is called Ghazal of the 50th Danaid. And the Danaids were 50 maidens who were supposed to marry these 50 young men who were their cousins, and they didn't want to do it. And so 49 of them murdered their bridegrooms on their wedding night, but one did not. She's supposed to be the good one, I guess. And so this is about the sister who did not murder her husband. I don't know if that reflects the lockdown so much. Ghazal of the 50th Danaid. Sisters, infernal virgins, would you kill again, knowing the endless sieves you would refill again? Oh, I should add that in hell, the 49 other Danaids have to continually fill a leaking sieve forever and forever and forever. So it's like the female version of Sisyphus. Sisters, infernal virgins, would you kill again, knowing the endless sieves you would refill again? Night is where the day's mistakes repeat. I swallow the bitter crumb, the sleeping pill again. Isn't the womb the sieve, the moon the spring from which blood's phases rise and fill and spill again? I carried thrice, bore twice, and once I grieved and shouldered my vessel up the morning's hill again. Dawn is a murderess, her hands stained pink. She slips in guiltily over the windowsill again. The arsenic hour, the argument resumes, our heated words, then silences smooth chill again. November, and the leaves flush red with shame. It's just the autumn draining the chlorophyll again. The night sky is the hull of a sinking boat. Stars are the silver holes that drill and thrill again. Beauty leaks away. The face burns hot. Youth is the liquor no one can distill again. I steep and brew a bitter wakefulness. The kitchen's nowhere engine whistles shrill again. At 50, the matron turns from the fickle moon and is not subject to her tyrant will again. Perhaps it's stalling, flipping the hourglass. I watch today's gold grains tick down to nil again. So that is one of the recentish poems. And another one, many people I think bought puzzles, jigsaw puzzles to do during the lockdowns. I bought a jigsaw puzzle. It was 1,000 pieces. It was a Hokusai's Great Wave off Kanagawa, which is, very famous image. I mean, it's on, tote bags and notebooks. And it seemed pleasing. It's, 3 or 4 colors, and it was 1,000 pieces, and I still have not finished it. But I did get a poem out of it. That's how poets think. At least you get a poem out of it. So this is called Lockdown Puzzle, Hokusai's Great Wave off Kanagawa. I will say it's in a stanza pattern where there are 6-line stanzas, and to me it feels a little sestina-ish. But it's not a sestina. It just feels, it's sort of sestina adjacent, I guess. So, even the border escapes me. There are pieces of the sky I cannot seem to put my finger on. The wave about to dash the boat to pieces is dashed to pieces. The pieces are shaped like fractals of flying sea foam. The outside of the box offers what might be pieced together. The wave lifts white and Prussian blue, while the sky lies flat and beige as the raw cardboard inside the box. The wave stands taller than a snow-topped mountain, and 3 boats slung low in the troughs. Rows of fat white dots, like white dots of foam, are the round tops of the heads of the fishermen who are looking not overhead at the crest about to crash, but down into the lurch of the sea, where they are likely to be drowned amidst a hissing mess of foam and wreckage. The puzzle lies spilled, shipwrecked on the table, all flotsam and jetsam, a piece of boat here, a mountaintop there, sky and wave all jumbled, the edge aligned with the horizon of the tabletops, steep drop. It comes over me in waves, this failure to put together the big picture. I had thought the working of it would give me a feeling of what? Peace? A fitting way to pass the time, a sense of pleasure in the making sense of things. The table is now no use as a surface. For months, it is all puzzle. The white shapes of water shaped like random spindrift, spinning across the beige ground of the table or the cardboard colored sky, fragments of yellow boats and blotches that could be sea foam, snowflakes or bowed heads. Maybe nothing finally locks the surface into an illusion of its smoothness. Even if I rhyme each shape with its absence, even if I finish this gesture, this wave, its monstrous gesture, after would not my giant hand be another crumbling, the world about to crumble, sweeping the confusion back into its box? So those are kind of recentish poems, but obviously I've been looking at older poems. And I have a lot of older poems that are about mythological figures, often female mythological figures who are in a sort of domestic space. I believe that the domestic space is quite mythic. Sorry, I'm just trying to fix my screen. All right. So in a way, the ghazal is part of a lot of other poems that we have female mythological figures. One of those figures is Persephone, that you will remember from Persephone in Hades, and he drags her down to the underworld. And in this poem, which is a very early poem, she writes a letter to her mother. I used to describe this as sort of an unhappy letter home from camp. But anyway, this is an older poem. First, hell is not so far underground. My hair gets tangled in the roots of trees, and I can just make out the crunch of footsteps, the pop of acorns falling, or the chime of a shovel squaring a fresh grave or turning up the tulip bulbs for separation. Day and night, creatures with no legs or too many journey to hell and back. Alas, the burrowing animals have dim eyesight. They are useless for news of the upper world. They say the light is loud. Their figures of speech all come from sound. Their hearing is acute. The dead are just as dull as you would imagine. They evolve like the burrowing animals, losing their sight. They may roam abroad sometimes, but just at night. They can only tell me if there was a moon. Again and again, moth-like, they are duped by any beckoning flame, lamps and candles. They come back startled and singed, sucking their fingers, happy the dirt is cool and dense and blind. They are silly and grateful and don't remember anything. I have tried to tell them stories, but they cannot attend. They pester you like children for the wrong details. How long were his fingernails? Did she wear shoes? How much did they eat for breakfast? What is snow? And then they pay no attention to the answers. My husband, bored with their babbling, neither listens nor speaks. But here there is no fodder for small talk. The weather is always the same. Nothing happens, though at times I feel the trees rocking in place like grief, clenching the dirt with tortuous toes. There is nothing to eat here but raw beets and turnips. There is nothing to drink but mud-filtered rain. Of course, no one goes hungry or toils, however many. The dead breed like the bulbs of daffodils, without sex or seed, all underground, yet no race has such increase, worse than insects. I miss you and think about you often. Please send flowers. I am forgetting them. If I yank them down by the roots, they lose their petals and smell of compost. Though I try to describe their color and fragrance, no one here believes me. They think they are the same thing as mushrooms. Yet no dog is so loyal as the dead, who have no wives or children and no lives, no motives, secret or bare, to disobey. Plus my husband is a kind master. He asks nothing of us, nothing at all. Thus fall changes to winter, winter to fall, while we learn idleness, a difficult lesson. He does not understand why I write letters. He says that you will never get them. True, mulched leaf paper sticks together, then rots. No ink but blood, and it turns brown like the leaves. He found my stash of letters, for I had hid it, thinking he'd be angry. But he never angers. He took my hands in his hands, my shredded fingers, which I have sliced for ink, thin paper cuts. My effort is futile, he says, and doesn't forbid it. I also don't have a clock on this. So this is an older book, Olives. This was my third collection. Hold on just a moment. Sorry. Anyway, I don't have a clock on this. I can't see how long I've been reading. Someone just wave at me. So this is a poem called Jigsaw Puzzles. So clearly jigsaw puzzles are, a theme, I guess. There's something, I think poets like them. I think there are a lot of good jigsaw puzzles poems. So this is another Jigsaw Puzzle poem, but it's quite a lot older than the one that I just read. First, the four corners, then the flat edges. Assemble the lost borders, walk the dizzy ledges. Hoard one color, try to make it all connected, the water and the deep sky, and the sky reflected. Absences align and lock shapes into place, and random forms combine to make a tree, a face. Slowly, you restore the fractured world and start to recreate an afternoon before it fell apart. Here is summer, here is blue, here two lovers kissing, and here the nothingness shows through where one piece is missing. So I realized that I have a lot of poems on kind of similar themes, and you know, I think the interest, especially in myths, it can be that you enter the myths in different places. There's a wonderful Even Boland poem about that, and the Homeric hymn to Demeter about Persephone. And I think it's certainly true, you know, you come in from different points of experience and different ages, and you know, you do keep entering in at a different point. So this is also a poem, again, about Persephone, who's been taken by Hades to the underworld, and it's also in a received form, but this is not a received poetic form. It is a received academic form, and I realized you could also make poems out of other kinds of received forms. This kind of academic poem is the multiple choice quiz. So this is called First Love, a Quiz, and it's about that same myth. He came up to me, A, in his souped up Camaro, B, to talk to my skinny best friend, C, and bumped my glass of wine so I wore the Ferris stain on my sleeve, D, from the ground in a lead chariot drawn by a team of stallions black as crude oil and breathing sulfur. At his heart, he sported a tiny golden arrow. He offered me A, a ride, B, dinner and a movie with a wink at the cliche, C, an excuse not to go back alone to the apartment with its sink of dirty knives, D, a narcissus with 100 dazzling petals that breathe the sweetness as cloying as decay. I went with him because A, even his friends told me to beware, B, I had nothing to lose except my virginity, C, he placed his hand in the small of my back and I felt the tread of honeybees, D, he was my uncle, the one who lived in the half-finished basement, and he took me by the hair. The place he took me to, A, was dark as my shut eyes, B, and where I ate bitter seed and became ripe, C, and from which my mother would never take me wholly back, though she wept and walked the earth and made the bearded ears of barley wither on their stalks and the blasted flowers drop from their sepals, D, is called by some men hell and others love, E, all of the above. So that was very fun to write, if a bit dark. So this is the book Like, and one of the fun things for me about this book, and also which makes it much easier to deal with in a poetry reading situation, is that the poems are simply arranged alphabetically. I had been thinking about doing that for a long time. I mean, I guess traditional poetry book, you know, is in sort of movements or sections, you know, 4 or 5 movements, with maybe some thematic arrangements. And I just thought I didn't want to do that. And I thought, what would happen if I just put everything in alphabetical order, which I did. And it really largely worked. I mean, it was almost sort of magical. I mean, I do believe in the magic of the alphabet. There were 1 or 2 poems that did not work in their placement, and I just changed the titles so that they did, because I am the poet and I can do these things. So that was a fun thing to do. And so, like, if I'm looking for a poem about, for instance, I think Tyler mentioned I also really appreciated that Tyler mentioned the exclamation points. I think we are told usually, in English classes to avoid exclamation points. And, certainly, I guess if you're writing prose, you want to largely do that. But then on social media, we use them all of the time. And in fact, not using one is considered, a microaggression. It's considered almost rude to put a period at the end of the sentence. But I have noticed that very few poems have them anymore. And I think poems are a place where we can exclaim and, have it be a true exclamation. So I like seeing exclamation points in poems, and I wish I saw more of them. So, this is another poem of the mytho-domestic. So this is about Pandora. I was translating Hesiod's Works and Days from the ancient Greek, and his Works and Days and his Theogony. Well, the Works and Days contains the first literary account of Pandora and the jar. It's a jar in Greek and not a box. I think Erasmus makes it a box, but it's a jar, which makes a lot more sense because she is a clay vessel with a womb, so she has much more in common with a clay jar than she does with just a box. And this is a poem. It has a very punny title. It's called A Jar. And it has some internal rhymes. I guess they're called leonine rhymes in the lines. And then I thought at some point, what if I just break these lines apart? You see that a lot in Cavafy, where the lines are just broken into two parts and really emphasize that rift in the poem. And I think it worked. So this is about that myth of Pandora and the jar and how all the evil things come out of it, except for hope, which is a kind of ambiguous story. The washing machine door broke. We hand washed for a week, left in the tub to soak. The angers began to reek, and sometimes when we spoke, you said we shouldn't speak. Pandora was a bride. The gods gave her a jar, but said, don't look inside. You know how stories are. The can of worms denied. It's never been so far. Whatever the gods forbid, it's sure someone will do. And so Pandora did, and made the worst come true. She peeked under the lid, and out all trouble flew. Sickness, war, and pain, nerves frayed like fretted rope. Every mortal bane with which mankind must cope, the only thing to remain, lodged in the mouth, was hope. Or so the tale asserts, and who am I to deny it? Yes, out like black-winged birds, the woes flew and ran riot. But I say that the woes were words, and the only thing left was quiet. And she's a character that there's a second poem in the book about her. And again, this kind of mytho-domestic, if I may make up such a word. And it's just called Pandora. But the nice thing about the alphabet is, that this poem and a jar have a nice space between them. So, you kind of run into her again. Pandora. It was the Iron Age. The men had been drinking, those two surly brethren, hindsight and forethought. They sent her down the cellar to fetch more booze, even though she'd murmured, you've both had enough. Forethought, at least, you'd think, would eschew a hangover, but then he was always cocky. He'd filched sparks from the gods and hadn't foreguessed, nickname aside, the prank would backfire. His liver hadn't yet begun to creak, as if an eagle tore it each morning. Hindsight, her husband, of course, remorsed their marriage. He'd said she was a punishment from Zeus, and that virginity made for a sorry dowry, depreciating soon as you drove it off the lot. There was just a dram and the drained kegs, and that she thought she'd drink herself, dregs be damned. Broach a new cask, they were huge, A fathom tall, a man could drown in them, so deep in the floor, so you could reach the mouth. She pried open the charactered seal with only her grappling fingers, but the wine had vinegared, or worse. What fumes, acrid with notes of brimstone, flies belched out. Hindsight would give her what for tonight for sure. Ouch. Just then the baby gave a disgruntled kick right behind where she would have had a belly button if she'd been born instead of just made up by poets. Hindsight hankered for sons, more braces of hands for his failure of a farm. But if it were a daughter, she'd have some company and name her Heather, maybe, or Hope. So those are two very different, explorations of that topic. Again, I have no clock on here. So I thought, Tyler, how are we doing?
Sorry. Yeah. Do you? I just got the sort of the clock announcement from Alan. Do you want to read maybe one or two more, and then we can move to the Q&A?
That sounds great. I think since it was mentioned, maybe I should read which is this is one of these poems that didn't fit in the alphabetical order of the book. It was originally published in Poetry Magazine as Sestina Like, and it didn't fit in the S's towards the end of the book. So I made it like the Sestina, so it's right smack in the middle of the book. And I think that worked, and it's okay. You can do it if you're the poet. It's your poems. So again, this is a sestina. The problem with the sestina is that it is 39 lines long, but it is not the problem that they have to be repeated words, because we repeat ourselves all the time. That is what we do when we speak, is we just say the same words over and over again, particularly if there's a narrative. So I think I had taught the sestina for years without really writing a real one. And I kept saying it was about obsession, and I don't think that really will get you through 39 lines long, maybe. And it's somewhat inspired by Sestina Bob by Jonah Winter. And if you don't know that poem, I invite you to Google it and look it up, because it's really delightful. So there will be 6 repetens, 6 words at the end, and they repeat in a kind of, permutation. And then the last 3 lines will have all 3 of those repetens together. So it's called Like the Sestina. Now we're all friends. There is no love, but like a semi-demi-goddess, something like a reality TV star lookalike named Simile or Me Too. So we like in order to be liked. It isn't like there's love or hate now. Even plain dislike is frowned on. There's no button for it. Like is something you can quantify. Each like you gather is almost something money-like, token of virtual support. Please like this page to stamp out hunger, and you'd like to end hunger and climate change alike, but it's unlikely. Like does diddly. Like just twiddles its unopposing thumbs up, likewise props up scarecrow silences. I'm like so over him, I overhear, but like he doesn't get it. Like, he's like, it's okay. Like, I don't even like him anymore, whatever. I'm all like, take like out of our chat. We'd all alike flounder agape, gesticulating like a foreign film, sans subtitles fall like dumb phones to mooted desuetude. Unlike with other crutches, when we use like, we're not just buying time on credit. Like displaces other words, crowds cuckoo-like endangered hatchlings from the nest. Click like if you're against extinction. Like is like invasive zebra mussels, or it's like those nutria things, or kudzu, or belike redundant fast food franchises. Each like, more like the next. Those poets who dislike inversions, archaisms, who just like plain English as she spoke. Why isn't like they're literally every other word? I'd like us just to admit that's what real speech is like. But as you like, my friend, yes, we're alike. How we pronounce, say, lichen and dislike cancer and war. So like this page, click like. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that. And thank you also again for serving on the exclamation point vanguard. This is a service you provide us. So I have a few prepared questions, and there is one that plays nicely with one that is in the Q&A. So I'll just offer one question to get us started. I will offer that question from the Q&A. Please, people, if you are so inclined, feel free to plop some more questions in there. And then, as Alan mentioned, I believe that there are a handful of grad students as well who have some questions, and we can jump to them. So my question pertains to translations in like specifically. There are a few poems in the book that you identify as translations. For example, the short passage from the Iliad. I think some Herodotus, and there are also a few more that you don't explicitly identify as translations, but that you point to as being after, say, Horace in a poem like Eheu, which is a sort of something related to Horace 2:14. So I'm wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit to how you maybe understand the difference between a translation and maybe something more like an adaptation or a poem following another poem.
Well, there is a kind of taxonomy of that, of versions and, paraphrase and all of that. I think when I say after someone, I think there's one that's after Severus, there's one that's after Horace. What I'm saying is I'm really going to give myself a lot of latitude here, and it is anchored to the poem. Both of those are fairly anchored to those poems, but I don't want someone to be looking at the Latin and say well, where is this phrase? And with the Severus, I took some very large leaps in order to keep the rhymed quatrains, which really could not come over into English without making some substitutions of one metaphor for another. So it's really a pretty large difference on the sort of just literal level, although I think it is keeping quite close to the essential meaning and structure of the poem. And I think that's true with the Horace also. And then the Herodotus was fun for me because, well, I was enjoying Herodotus, just so many fun stories. And I was just thinking these stories feel, like they could be versified. I mean, it's really a versification of the prose of Herodotus. And then I thought, since Herodotus is almost the father of prose, among other things, I'll make them into prose sonnets. I would call them Megan sonnets after Josh Megan, who's done a few of these, where they are full on scanning sonnets, but I print them as blocks of prose. I think there was a review somewhere that objected to the fact that they were too sonnet-like. They didn't see what I was doing. They were like, this strangely rhymey and iambic pentametry for a prose thing. But I wanted it to look like prose and to read both ways. You could read it as a sonnet and you could read it against, the unseen line breaks, I guess. I don't know if those worked or not, but I had fun with them. And it's nice, if you put a book together, to have some things that just look different on the page. You don't want everything looking the same. And I thought it was nice to have the prosy blocks, I guess.
I had a very happy relationship started with Josh a number of years ago at a Breadloaf Writers Conference, predicated entirely on my having noticed that he had done that with a block of prose.
Excellent. Well, anyway, just let him know I'm giving him full credit for this as a sonnet form.
I will do that. We have one Q&A that kind of rhymes a little bit with this question, and it's from Kate Coles. The question is if you could talk a little bit about how living in two languages in both literary and practical lives inflects and informs your poems in English.
It does. On the one hand, I think, I've been an expat writer for a long time, over 20 years. I think there is a slight anxiety that you kind of lose continuous contact with your own idiom. You start to say kind of oddly phrased things, or so I'm always a little bit concerned about that. And then I am a child, as it were, in another language. I'm a child in Greek. My comprehension is excellent, but I'll never be a native speaker. In fact, I'm reading Pnin right now, and there's so much about this, about what it's like to be a complete, mature literary adult in one language, and then only able to have cursory kinds of conversations in another language. But I think it's partly, in a language that you didn't grow up in, all of those cliches and figures of speech that people don't think about are still poetry to me. Like I just think, wow, that's such a cool way of looking at things. I mean, I have whole poems based on these things, like the Greek for nightmare is Ephialtes. I mean, Ephialtes is, on the one hand, the Titan of nightmare, I think, in things like Hesiod, but it's also the name of the Greek that gives the game away at Thermopylae and betrays the Greeks to the Persians. And that to me is just, there's this whole poem, this whole metaphor in what is a normal word for my kids of like, I had a nightmare. So I think there's that. I do also, I mean, I think most poets have English language poets have a sort of very Anglo-Saxony register and a Latinate register. I would also have a Hellenic register. So there are quite a few, I think, more Greek words as well as Latinate words. And so I am thinking about that. And there are whole lines that could not be translated back into Greek because they are translated from Greek. And they become poetry in English, but backwards wouldn't work. I have a poem where I talk about bouzouki music, and I talk about, in this music, the hands of lovers always rhyme with knives. That's a poetic line in English. It is a tautology in Greek, where they do actually rhyme.
Wow. Have you ever attempted, or know many people that have attempted to translate something and then translate it back?
Yeah, I mean, I have. I mean, I think it is something that people do, and but I don't have examples immediately to mind. But I think it's always kind of interesting because I mean, even Google Translate kind of does that. I think it's gotten better now, but it used to sort of produce almost poeticisms. I think now it's actually fairly accurate.
Right. Well, let's turn to some of our other panelists here. Maybe Erin, would you like to start us off?
Sure, I'd love to. Hi, Alicia. Thanks so much for reading for us today. The last time I heard you read was actually in Boston on the eve of the pandemic, right before it started. And so I'm curious, besides puzzles and near murder and being dragged down to hell like Persephone, could you speak a little bit more to your pandemic experience in Athens? And also, did you take any consolation maybe or perspective from any historical reading you were doing or translation that you might be working on?
I think probably our experience in Athens, I mean, I think everyone's experience was slightly different. Greece went into a very serious lockdown very early on. I think looking at Italy, Greece was very frightened because, we were very close to there and we're very close culturally, and our situations with hospitals and so on. And I managed, though, to sort of bolt to this island, which I think is the thing you were not supposed to do. But anyway, we went there for 3 weeks. And even on the island, you were not allowed to go fishing or go swimming. I mean, you could leave the house for one of 6 reasons, which you had to text on your phone to the government. So it was really a very serious lockdown. So one was stuck in this mytho-domestic situation all the time. I did start thinking about classical examples of plagues. I mean, classical literature is just, it's eat up with plagues. I mean, it's in line 9, I think, of the Iliad. The first people who die in the Iliad die of the plague. It's a big factor in a lot of the plays. Oedipus starts with a plague, and Sophocles is kind of criticizing how the plague was handled in Athens. So for a modern audience, I mean a contemporary audience rather, of Oedipus, would have seen, okay, something's wrong, rotten in the government, and that's why the plague isn't going well. That would have reflected directly on Pericles. I mean, I think we sometimes just forget the context in which these things were viewed. And I started translating the plague section in Virgil's Georgics, which is all about animals dying from the plague. But again, I think I just started looking to my sort of classical education and references and rereading those things through that that mask.
Nick, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the reading, Alicia. It was wonderful. I was really interested to hear that you have a selected coming out. And so I kind of wanted to ask you about the process of curation there. If you feel like it's been revelatory in any way, going back through your older work and seeing, you know, I don't know, thematic rhymes or things that you return to that you've been focused on since the beginning of your career. And similarly, like, are you opposed to going back and revising older work so that it meets sort of your current standards or expectations for a poem, or is it just a matter of curation for you, and arrangement, or how are you going about the selected?
Well, I mean, I would not revise an older poem. I really feel that was written by someone else, and you know, it's not my business. Like if I object to something about it, take that knowledge and move forward, you know, to a new poem. I just don't feel that I even, yeah, once basically a poem has appeared in print, unless something really niggles me or you know, really is just wrong, like there's a mistake or something. In fact, with Sestina got accepted by Poetry Magazine, and then I realized when the proofs came in that I had an extra stanza. I had gone like so crazy with the like things that I had actually produced a sort of hypermetric Sestina, and I cut that down. But no, I wouldn't change anything. I mean, part of it is I mean, it is interesting to see things that repeat. It's also, there are a lot of poems, you know, that I actually end up quite liking that I don't read at readings very often, you know, so it's kind of interesting to revisit poems that I rarely, are not sort of part of the greatest hits, but I thought still made the cut. And then it's sort of interesting, you know, I asked a lot of people, are there things you feel I must include or must not include? And it was sort of interesting to me that some of the poems that I maybe thought were weaker were popular with other people, and I sort of want to respect, like, okay, this poem has an audience. But then there's kind of a relief also of divesting yourself of weaker poems that probably shouldn't have been booked or collected. You know, that you want to show a sort of streamlined, you know, new and improved version. So, you know, that, and in fact, I ended up looking at some poems that I never collected, that I thought maybe this should have been collected, because we might do a sort of little extra section of uncollected poems. And that was interesting because most of the time I was correct not to collect things. So mostly what I learned was that I was correct that certain poems were weak in the first place.
And Max.
Thanks for the reading, Alicia. I'm gonna ask a question about poetry and humor and form and humor. Because I was reading, when I read I felt like maybe more than your other books, this book seemed a little sillier and a little funnier. And maybe that's not the case, but I really enjoyed that aspect of it. And so perhaps this goes to Tyler's Twitter and glitter kind of mode too, to some of your poetry. I thought that was really interesting. And so I was curious if you could speak about, you know, like how humor and form are working together for you. If you feel like there are things that form has taught you about humor, or if you feel like on the flip side, if there are things that humor has taught you about form.
Well, rhyme and form, well, form and humor do have a lot in common. I mean, a joke and a poetic form have a lot in common. I'm not necessarily good at jokes, and I can never remember them, and then I end up, you know, in the tall weeds and can't remember the punchline. But I mean, what they do and what rhyme does, and I think both of them can flip a kind of switch in the brain that, you know, that thing that makes you, I mean, laughter is involuntary, as is, you know, certain kinds of poetic reactions. It's sort of a physical reaction. And I think what it does is, if you have a form or a convention, maybe I should talk about conventions rather than forms. A convention is great to work with because what you're setting up is, you do a convention that people recognize, like a multiple choice poem. People recognize that. They expect certain things to happen. And then you get to play, do I fulfill that convention? Do I undermine that convention? Do I, take that convention to some kind of ridiculous level? So I think you've got something to work with. There's some space between the poet and the reader of, it's a kind of, not exactly a flirtation, but there's sort of like, which way is this going to go? It's kind of a game. And rhyme certainly does that. Like, if a poem starts to rhyme, you're setting up a certain convention and expectations on the reader. If you break that convention, like you end up with a line that doesn't rhyme, that can have a physical reaction. If you set up a rhyme, like a complicated rhyme, people are listening for it and they wonder how you're going to fulfill that expectation. I think the ghazal does that, where you're going to have ill again, and where's that going to go? And how many times can that be fulfilled in a surprising or interesting fashion? So I think there is a lot in common with them. I think it's interesting to me that there are poems that I think are funny that people find really, really dark. And there are poems that I
Can I just
find
interrupt to
really,
ask which ones you think are funny that people think
well,
are too dark?
and there are poems that I think are really dark that people laugh at, and I was like, no, that's not funny. That's like terrifying. I mean, sometimes it's how you present it. But for instance, there are different ways to read it. Like the multiple choice poem, that can be funny with an audience, and it can be really like disturbing to an audience. Partly depending on my presentation, maybe, but also depending on the audience. So, so I think it's always interesting to me, things that get laughs and things that get gasps are not always what I would expect.
That actually might be a way to pivot to one more question that we have in the Q&A that I will slightly expand. Paisley Rectal asks if you could speak a little bit about your work with Syrian refugees. And this obviously isn't necessarily the place where one might expect humor, but I'm wondering if you might also speak a little bit in answering that about Refugee Fugue in Like, which has a section of Aegean epigrams, which, though they aren't necessarily all or even any of them particularly funny, have that kind of epigrammatic sprezzatura that often does reveal something that if isn't humor exactly, is something like it, in its sort of strange and incisive little insights. So would you speak to any of those things?
Well, those of you who follow the news, Greece, still has a lot of refugees entering, but particularly in 2015 and 2016, I mean, there were sometimes, thousands and thousands of people arriving on tiny islands within a week or a month. And, I think the numbers would be staggering. And there was a lot of volunteering and people trying to help. I think Syrian refugee crisis is a misnomer because there were of course a lot of Syrians from the war, but probably almost as many Afghans and people from Iraq and just lots of different people coming for different reasons. It was kind of a privilege to be able to work directly with helping people, and I enjoyed also working with volunteers. The humor is kind of an interesting thing with that because I think again, it's easy to define refugees by their misery and what they're fleeing, but it was really interesting to just meet different people who often were quite resilient and could laugh at some aspects of their existence and find joy in things as well. But there was a point when a lot of people were drowning coming over, and a lot of those were children, and I had children that age at that time, and it was just very chilling to me that like the water where my kids were splashing and playing was also touching the bodies of drowned children, and that stayed with me for quite a while. And I wasn't really sure how to write about some of this for a while, but at the same time, it was all I was thinking about. And I think the epigrams were a way of having that kind of distance, because they have to have a little bit of a twist, of some wit. I would say wit rather than humor, where, you know, they have a sort of twist to them. And I think that the epigrams, which, you know, and they're quite traditional to have epigrams about drowned people in the Aegean, you know, the Greek anthology is full of them. So it seemed appropriate, and it seemed a way that I could write about it, you know, with some distance, and, you know, trying not to put myself too much in the picture, not exploit this experience of other people, but to reflect on it, or to, you know, just handle it in some ways.
Well, that was great, and we are just about out of time here. So I will thank you on behalf of myself and everyone else here at the in the creative writing department at Utah, and thank you so much, Alicia.
Thank you for all those great questions. I really appreciate it, and the wonderful introduction.
You bet.
On behalf of the creative writing program here at the University of Utah, thanks again, Alicia. It's been wonderful. Also, thanks to Max, Nick, and Aaron for helping us with the question and answer portion. And of course, thank you to Tyler for moderating and playing host to this morning's festivities. For those of you that are in attendance and looking for more of our programming, in a couple of weeks, we'll have Camille Dungy with us on Zoom. That's Thursday, October 7th. So we hope to see you again for that. Thank you so much again, Alicia. Have a great day. Take care. And thanks to all of you for being here. Cheers.